Welcome to PodBiz, the money behind the mic, where we get into the business of podcasting. I'm Norma Jean Belenky, a podcast and media strategist, specializing in marketing and audience development.
And I'm John Kiernan. I'm a podcast producer, and we're asking the question that's on everyone's mind. Where is the money in podcasting?
Each week, we talk to podcast industry professionals, marketers, and creators who are turning podcasts into a thriving business and making the industry what it is today.
With real revenue, real strategies, and real results.
If you're looking to grow or scale your show, and of course monetize, you're in the right place.
So let's get down to PodBiz.
Welcome to PodBiz. Today, we're talking to Stevie Manns, a podcast producer for BlackRock. We'll be talking about branded podcasts, ROI, brand lift, and of course, where the money is in podcasting. Let's get down to PodBiz. Hello, and welcome to PodBiz, Stevie Manns. Stevie Manns is a podcast producer with BlackRock and independently, and they are here today with us. So, Stevie, where's the money in podcasting?
Right to the money question, right?
That's it. That's what we all want to know.
Where is the money in podcasting? That's a great question. I feel like everyone's like, where is the money in podcasting? I work for a brand. I do think there is a lot of money in working for a brand, whether it's a corporate or, whatever. But I really think that's where it is.
Absolutely. And, looking at the entire industry, it's interesting, right? Because I think so many independent creators or people who maybe have podcasting skills and, maybe work independently or freelance think like, oh, the money's in advertising. And it is, we have a lot of episodes on that, but a lot of brands are seeing the value in podcasting. And, from that inside out kind of perspective that you have, tell us a little bit about what, maybe specifically BlackRock, maybe not, what companies are getting in terms of ROI and exposure from having a branded podcast.
Sure. I mean, I think if we step back for a minute and kind of look at how much are people spending on podcasts, and maybe, to answer maybe your first question in a little bit more detail, I think there's a lot of major corporations who are spending at least $100,000 on a podcast, and they're reporting like 90% satisfaction with that. So they obviously are getting ROI for that. And what does that look like? And I think, it can certainly be very hard to quantify the ROI when, if you're not if it's not sort of direct sales, how are you then quantifying what the value is for you? And it can be, a number of things. It can be, sure, it can be exposure. Everyone loves exposure, don't they? It can be downloads. We can talk about that. It can be, are people really engaging with the brand? Are we seeing a brand like engagement over time? Are we seeing that uplift? And how are we measuring that? And I think, that really comes down to having so many teams working together to measure the success of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for companies that are going to put budget into traditional advertising, right? When we're talking about the amount of advertising that just goes into even digital, right? When you factor in podcasting, it's such a small piece of the pie, but can create such big brand lift.
Huge. I mean, at BlackRock, we've done a number of things. We've certainly looked at like an out-of-home campaign, and to that point of like, what does that brand lift look like? And we've obviously, and it's very intuitive. When we post an episode, people think more favorably about the brand, and we see that in the numbers. That there's now some great reports that are coming out, whether it's from Edison Research or whether it's from Co-Host or Sounds Profitable, and brands are really seeing a halo effect. And we're seeing that, I think that, and I'm forgetting which report it is, but they've reported that 61% of listeners felt much more favorable towards the brand more generally. You might see a bigger uplift than that with your particular brand, but it really does happen. And I think if you think about what your podcast is going to be, it is the top of that sales funnel. It shouldn't be kind of lower down than that. And it is the way for somebody to kind of like start to engage with you and your brand and what you are doing versus trying to sell them anything. And I think the way that we approach it is we're not trying to sell you anything. It's thought leadership. And in fact, for most brands, 76% of them prioritize like thought leadership as what their podcast will provide for you to eventually kind of think over time. And it's just this sort of continuous, imprinting of over time. We want you to think of us when you need that thought leadership or whether it then, comes to a sale down the line. And it really is a long game, and it's really worth putting in that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what you said is really great in terms of that top of funnel, right? oh, I should put my hands up here. And for in terms of top of funnel, it's one of those things where it's not a direct sell, right? You don't want to come off as pushy because that's not what the experience is about. The experience is about saying, hey, we have this expertise and we want to share that with you. And we want to welcome you within our community or within um, people that utilize our brand or that are our consumers, but without the pressure to sell. It doesn't have that kind of direct pressure. And so as a result of that, a lot of brands are seeing that uplift down the line, like you said. And when we talk about that down the line, an eventual ROI, what does that conversation look like?
It certainly looks like, are we making content that we can certainly send to like our existing clients? Do we think that, is this content that potential clients are looking for? Are they seeking this out? Are we providing them something that they need? And I think that's something that you should be doing with any podcast, is like, you should be looking for a need and you should be filling that need. And for me, that is the ROI. And it's like, are we making content that people need? Is it content that isn't there? Are we serving it in a way that is different to our competitors? And, are we seeing subscribers over time? Are we seeing downloads over time? What does our consumption rate look like? And I think for me, excuse me. And for me, if we're seeing those numbers increase and increase and increase, I think we're doing something right. And certainly, there's benchmarks to have and there's goals that you set out with. But again, for me, over time, seeing those numbers uptick, we're doing something right when we see subscribers, downloads, like a high consumption rate. And I think for a brand, and this is always one of those questions where nobody likes to talk about their numbers, but I think for brands, if you're getting 75% consumption rate on average, like, you're doing really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about consumption rate, for anybody who may not be aware, we're talking about the percentage of the episode that's being completed. So what Stevie is saying is that if maybe your audience is completing the episode 75% of the time, that's a really big metric. It's not like flicking it on, being like, oh gosh, they're trying to sell me something, or I don't like this guest, or whatever it is, and then just, moving on. But active, consistent audience that will grow with you sustainably is a really big deal. Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Well, Stevie, at BlackRock, you guys have the bid, right? And so you have that podcast. And like you said, there's thought leadership and there's also content that resonates with current clients, all that kind of good stuff. But you also have produced a few things independently. So tell us about that and then how you got into the podcasting industry.
Wow. How did I get into podcasting? I found my way in through probably unconventional methods. So I was actually working for a finance company before I started working in podcasts in finance. So it was sort of, my original plan was, I want to get out of finance, only to U-turn and go straight back into finance. But it made sense for me. And I had always had a creative track running alongside my professional track that never made me any money. And when I moved to New York, I was doing a lot of music, and you and I have talked about that. And I had started a musicians circle. It was I think it was a monthly event that we did, and we had musicians kind of in the round. And we were looking at ways to market that event. And I thought, well, if we create a podcast where we interview the musicians who are coming on to the event, people can kind of get to know them, because it's really hard to get people to part with their money in New York, especially when so much is, there's free events, there's free music. You could go down to an Irish pub and like see a covers band or whatever. And the industry has certainly since changed, even from 7 to 10 years ago from having done this. But I found that was a really successful way, starting a newsletter with that, to get people to kind of come to the shows and sort of cross-pollinate their audiences like that. So I started doing that. That was kind of the first podcast I did. And when I came out of college, I started working in radio. So I sort of had the podcast background. I then learned to do my own production. I was also doing music. So that was sort of part of something that I'd learned. So I had all of the skills, and podcasting sort of served as a way to do it where I didn't need a radio station. I didn't need anything. I could do it myself. I certainly could have done it maybe on YouTube, but I think, a podcast certainly served better for a music show, or so I thought at the time. So I started doing that. I started another podcast with a friend about Star Trek. I know, big nerd. And during the pandemic, I had one of those moments, I'm sure as everybody did, where I thought, what am I doing with my life? And do I like what I'm doing?
Yeah. The existential COVID question, right? What does it all mean?
Absolutely.
What am I doing?
Yep. And I was reading Glennon Doyle's book, actually, and a friend had asked her a question, and she said, what is the if you could imagine your life, what is the truest version that you could come up with? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I thought, if I did that myself and I came up with a blank piece of paper, what would I want to do? If there were no limits and I didn't have to worry about anything, what would I want to do? And I thought, well, I really like podcasting, but what does that look like? Is it that I want to be a podcast host and somehow, make a living doing that? Is it that I really like the production? Is it that I like the strategy of it? And I thought the only way that I'm going to know is if I do more. So I took on, I think I sought out 2 or 3 other clients. And so I was doing my full-time job, my own podcast, my own 2 podcasts, and then I found two or three others that I started working on because I had time. There was nothing else to do. It was COVID.
We were locked in our homes, right?
Exactly. So I started doing that and working with clients, and realizing what I really enjoyed. And for me, it was the production side. It was producing. It was strategy. It was like helping a host kind of come out of their shell and like create something really cool, and working on the episodes and like what a season's going to look like over time. I really enjoyed that. And I thought, okay, that's really cool. Now I know that I want to be a producer. And I was able to leave my job and look for a production job. And I got really lucky because the job with BlackRock was taking the finance experience that I'd had, which was like 16, 17 years in the industry, and pairing that with the passion that I had. And I got the job, and I think it's perfect for me.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it was one of those things where you were really set on making that change. And then the universe said, okay, well, here's an opportunity to do it, with the over decade and a half experience you already have in a specific subject matter. So yeah, what a lucky situation.
But and I forgot to answer your other questions of what have I worked on? And I think I'm very grateful to you for where I'm working with you in your previous role at Podbean. I started working with a Ukrainian journalist, I think maybe 2.5 years ago now. Yuri is a journalist from Ukraine, and he took up arms. He enlisted in the army, and he decided that he was going to help get the message out of what was actually happening in Ukraine and from his perspective. And he is such a great storyteller. And he would create these short podcast episodes, maybe 3 minutes long, on a daily basis. He's since kind of pulled back to maybe a couple times a week. And I produced that for him and put it out. So I love doing that for him. I've probably continued the ones, maybe stopped one that I was doing. I still do my Set Phaser Star Trek podcast.
Phaser.
Yes, get your phasers to fun. It's not called that. And I have worked. There was one that I was working on that I think I've hit pause on at the moment just because of a lot of the things going on. It doesn't feel like the right time to put it out, but it's always fun to have a creative project on the side. And still, I also consult for other podcasters if they want some help with their shows.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, having spoken to Yuri and, virtually met him, his story is so compelling, and in terms of just somebody who really wants to share what's going on the ground with this journalist background and that human angle. I think that, that was a project that just felt like it was it just felt like there was just such a purpose behind it. So I could see, why it would be such a passion project for you. And, I think that that's the great thing about podcasting, right? Some podcasts are forever and some podcasts are for now or for later. And some are for fun and some are for professionals and some are for the industry and some are, to grow and some are just to have as your niche hobby. And so it's nice that you have that combination of all of those as well. Well, in that pivot from finance to podcast finance. So within your podcasting career, what would you say is one key move or even like a mindset or metric that made the biggest difference in your career or the work that you've done with clients?
I think working with somebody who really cares about what they do comes across loud and clear. And if, you're making something that you don't care about, that will also come across loud and clear. So, even whether it's a branded thing or whether it's something else, you've still got to care about it. And I think I have such a passion for making something and making it sound really cool. There's certain, subjects within finance that I'm like, I don't understand yield curves all that well. I really don't. But
Bring in the experts, right?
exactly, bring in the experts. And I'm never talking about it. I'm obviously behind the scenes, but like, I still need to understand what's being talked about. Because I'm kind of the stand-in for the listener, and if the listener doesn't understand it, then there's no point in making it. So I think like I have a passion for the subject matter in general, and trying to find a way to tell that story. And I think that's the key thing. Like, I love telling stories about it, and like, how can we tell the story in a fun, edutaining way, I guess, in terms of educating and entertaining. And I think, that sort of mindset is key to my day job.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's something that people may not know about what you do?
I think I come across this every day. People don't know that there is a person behind the show. I find everyone seems to think that the producer is the host. Like, the host knows everything. And I'm like, no. He is he's a great host, but he does get to sort of turn up and do it. And there is a person behind the show who has a full-time job that runs everything. Everything that you see about that show is run by this one person.
Yeah.
And that is often something that I find, so interesting. And it's that thing of, the podcast that you're listening to at the end of the day is the tip of the iceberg. It is that 5%, and 95% of it is what you don't see below the surface. So I always find it sort of staggering when people talk about, podcasts, and they're, huge consumers of podcasts, but don't know everything that goes into it as we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much behind the scenes, especially, when you're working with a brand that has such, high expectations and standards. It's something where, it would be impossible for the host to both host the show and do everything behind it, because it's such a labor intensive endeavor, right? When you're listening to a great podcast, and I've talked about this a lot in terms of audience development, presenting at conferences and stuff like that, like, the secret to great audience development and to making a great show is labor. There are, best practices, and, we can wax on about those forever. But, sometimes like, being fresh and having somebody that doesn't try and do all 20 jobs at once actually makes a huge difference. And I think a lot of brands know that, because they're operating on this like very high level in terms of having that professional standard and all of that. But I think for independent creators, there can be a lot of like internal gaslighting, right? Of, well, why doesn't my show sound like that? Well, you don't have a
10 people
Stevie,
behind it.
right?
Yeah. Or like The Daily, and they've got, 15 producers or something behind that.
Exactly.
But that, that's an interesting point, or another sub point to that is, know what you're good at, and don't try and do it all. I think when I was working with, I was doing a lot of music, and I'm working with bands as you do. I'm not a drummer. I can probably hold a beat to something that's very, very simple, but like, I'm not a drummer. And it's that's the sort of leadership learning is like, I don't know everything. I can't do it all. I'm going to like bring in people who are great at what they do, and they can, suggest ideas, and then we can come up with that together. Or if I'm leading the project, I'll be like, okay, that works, or this is what I like if this is my project. And, recognizing your own limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that rings true for so many people, right? To just hone in on your zone of genius. Because it can be easy to say, oh, well, it's not that much work, or, oh, I don't necessarily have to outsource it. But if it saves you from burnout in the long run, it's totally worth it, because you'll still have a show. So
it's a tough one as well, because you're like, I think there's a lot to be said for like learning a little bit about everything.
oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But not trying to be that expert or to sort of take that on.
No. I mean, I think it's also one of those things where like editing, you either love editing or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to John, my co-host, who edits this podcast.
Thanks, John, for making me sound great. I believe in you.
Thanks, John. Well, if you had to start over today, would you do anything differently in terms of, your career within podcasting, or, within some of the shows to help them grow faster or smarter?
Tough question, because I don't really believe in regrets, and I think everything has happened the way that it was supposed to happen. I think, I graduated in 2008, which was a terrible time to graduate, as you know.
Oh, likewise, class of 2008. Woo woo.
Wonderful, wonderful time. So I think like working in a creative industry is always difficult. It's been difficult. And I think this has been the right path for me. I think, one of my own thoughts as I look to the future is, do I want to stay in this industry? And when I say this industry, I don't mean podcasting. I more mean whether it's finance. Do I want to move into media? Do I want to move into tech, or how do I want to do it? I think probably work, like I believe in working with brands. I think you can make some really, really cool stuff with brands. And going back to the first question, I think that's where the money is. So, I'm thinking about, like, can I get my creative needs met? Can I also pay my bills from doing it? So I'm thinking about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And, before we go, I always like to ask one more question. What are you excited about? What are you looking forward to within the podcasting industry?
I'm excited about the fact that I think more people are beginning to listen to podcasts. And certainly, like, in age brackets that we haven't really seen before, more boomers are listening, more women are listening, more people of color are listening and making shows. I think that is also broadening out. And I think, we've certainly right-sided from 2020 and the COVID pandemic of just everyone having a podcast, and, the dedicated people making shows for their audiences. I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about the brand space. I think people are really beginning to take it quite seriously. I think we're also beginning to see people take some really creative leaps of faith. I think there are some companies that are doing some really interesting things, like Lower Street. I know Pacific Content has done a lot of stuff, pairing brands with, associated ideas. And what I mean by that is, I know that Lower Street have been talking about a new podcast called, I think it's By Wine Enthusiast, and they've launched a podcast by Wine Enthusiast about true crime. What a great pairing, because obviously, people, those are two things that really do go together, or certainly can. I remember they talked about an example of Jeep, and when they were, no, sorry, it wasn't Jeep, Bronco. And when they were coming out with the new Ford Bronco, they did a whole, podcast series about the Bronco and, like, the production line, why it stopped, why it's starting up again, and, really tapped into a market. But they're making really interesting content and doing it in, like, narrative ways. Or, I know that Casper has a podcast about sleep and sleep specialists, and, like, being really thoughtful about how to make that content in a way that really resonates with people. And they're not selling mattresses, and they're not selling wine. They're not, saying, like, oh, let's talk about this new wine. That's not how people are doing it. And I think the fact that they're doing it that way is really raising the bar. And I want the bar to be raised, because we're in the, I think people are only going to get better that way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree. It almost reminds me of, like, the 1950s of watching a TV show that's just entirely sponsored by one brand,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it really kind of speaks to the way that a brand can look at a demographic and say, okay, we know if you listen to true crime, you might be a wine drinker. So this feels like the right niche, right? And so it definitely is a time of really big creativity for brands where there's an impact that adds a lot of value outside of specific, pressure for sales. Absolutely.
Yeah. I always just love talking about, there's someone I spoke to, and he's a photographer, and he now, works for Rolling Stone. Like, he does a lot of, very, very specifically in terms of music, Shervin Lainez. And I talked to him about how he sort of rose to this. And he was, in the scenes of New York, and he said he had a camera, and he only had enough money for one light. And he became really, really good at just being able to use one light. And I was like, that's so interesting. And just, the way that limits can actually make us better.
Absolutely.
And, like, another example is, Desi Arnaz. I got into a whole Lucille Ball phase.
Oh, yeah. I think we all did, kind of pandemic, post-pandemic. Yeah.
But learning that, he came up with that sort of 3-camera sitcom idea, and he wasn't somebody who had that background. And I think podcasting is bringing in people from new backgrounds, whether it's journalism or whether it's videography or something like that. Having these new people with these new ways of thinking, I think, will probably drive the media forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Stevie Manns, thank you so much for joining us.
Norma Jean, thank you so much.